Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, part 49 of my series, Ecclesiology for Sedevacantists, based on Dogmatic Theology, Volume 2, Christ Church by Msgr G. Van Noort. Well, I think I've established in the previous section the validity of the legitimacy of the traditional bishops today. There is some further discussion, and I will basically go finish that up here. It is certainly, picking up on page 153 where I left off, it is certainly not a backbreaking job to find the legitimate successor of Peter. Well, at least most times it's not. Sometimes they've had multiple claimants. The bigger challenge now is discovering that there isn't one, and where there had been up to where we can know where to start from. First, it is a fact beyond question that Christ Church can never fail to have a successor to Peter. Again, obviously, this is not counting periods of Sedevacante, but usually those are short. Okay, this one's longer, so this is kind of a situation he wasn't thinking of. Secondly, no one ever seriously claims to hold Peter's office except the Roman pontiffs. Well, once again, we have that complication. Well, some things have been overtaken by events here. One, we haven't had Peter for a very long time. And two, we do have any number of false claimants. And so there is those added complexities. But we can always go back to, we don't have to go back that far to when we for sure had popes. And fortunately, whatever ambiguity one might have, you know, from the end of Pope Pius XII to the resignation of Paul VI, doesn't change the legitimacy aspect for any traditional bishops as it stands. So, in a way, that's kind of providential. That question doesn't have to be answered for us to move forward with an authoritative way to go. So, see, something still always exists, something that's discoverable. Okay. In other words, none of the apostles shared in the sacred power of governing the universal church except as a member of the Patron Apostolic College. And see, you're still part of the Patron Apostolic College, even if Peter isn't himself president. Those 21 bishops of way back when are an ample precedent for that. They were still part of the Patron Apostolic College, even though Peter couldn't name any of them or recognize any of them for however long they served. Nevertheless, validly and legitimately, with jurisdiction as fully regular bishops, until finally the next pope did come along, and surprise, surprise, of course he affirmed them all. Why wouldn't he? And the same should be today, you know, unless some particular one or another act's really disgusting. You know, and that's up to your individual behaviors, Your Excellencies, if any are listening. You know, don't be disgusting. You know, be the sort of person a pope should say, yes, I affirm that this bishop was well chosen. Okay, enough of that. If that were held true for the apostles themselves, it holds true for all the more obviously for the apostles' successors. How could a man belong to the college of the successors of the apostles unless he were united to the head of the college and acknowledged by him as belonging to it? A man could hardly be a cabinet member if the president refused to accept him. Any man, then, who boasts of apostolic succession, but is not united to the Roman pontiff, may indeed actually possess the power of orders. He may even by purely physical succession occupy a chair formerly occupied by an apostle. At least he could do so. But he would not be a genuine successor of the apostles in their pastoral office. He would be a usurper. And I just wanted one of the other things. Of course, that was the example of the period of Sedevacante, but it also, there's the other historical precedent in the earlier apostolic ages of the first several centuries of the church, in which many bishops were appointed not by popes, but by other bishops, and maybe voted for their communities, recommended by civil princes and what have you. But they were already from the get-go, of course, recognized by those bishops who were already recognized by the pope, and at some point along the way, probably fairly promptly, you know, the Pope would be informed, oh, so-and-so has made bishop of such and such, and the Pope would initiate correspondence with that new bishop. So, you know, when there was a Pope. And there have been periods of Sedevacante back then where, again, that initiation of correspondence might have to wait a few years. But it was the same. There was that same continuity, that same community. Okay. Scullion 2, Theory of an Extraordinary Mission. Since the original Protestants obviously lacked apostolicity of government, They took refuge in an appeal to the theory of an extraordinary mission. To put it briefly, they maintained that God could at some time raise up a group of men by an extraordinary vocation and confer on them apostolic functions if current apostolic pastors should become viciously corrupt. This was the case, they asserted, with Luther and the other reformers. It is clear, however, if any such extraordinary mission were ever to be granted by God, it would have to be proven by miracles or other clearly divine trademarks. The plain truth is, however, that Christ's own promises completely rule out the possibility of any such extraordinary mission. Understand now, we are talking about a mission by which a man absolutely apart from and utterly independent of apostolic succession would receive from God the power to rule or reform the church. There's a nice footnote here. Many saints have arisen from time to time to reinvigorate the moral life of Catholics. Bernard, Francis of Assisi, Catherine of Siena, Charles Borromeo. But they've always done so in a spirit of perfect obedience to the church's legitimate pastors. Whether I'll be recognized along that, I don't know, but let's just say that's what I insist on doing. And I'll leave it to others of history down in future ages to judge to what extent I've succeeded. But that is what I strive to do, by the way. So Christ conferred sacred powers on his apostles and their successors until the end of the world. Further, he promised them his perpetual and unfailing assistance. Consequently, Christ would be contradicting himself were he ever to deprive the legitimate successors of the apostles of their authority. Granted that fact, it would be a further contradiction for God to confer the same power or similar power on other men who were not in union with the ordinary successors. In that hypothesis, there would be two separate and independent sources of authority, both demanding by divine right obedience from the same subjects. The only thing that could result in such a hypothesis would be confusion and schism in Christ's church. And in that event, one would imply that God himself, who willed his church to be unified, was himself sowing the seeds of necessary division. From another point of view, God has no need of extraordinary legates in the sense claimed above to preserve his church from corruption. 3. Apostolicity of membership means that the church in any given age is and remains numerically the same society as that planted by the apostles. It was stated above that the church's government is necessarily apostolic. In brief, the college of bishops who rule it always forms one and the same juridical person with the apostolic college. See 119 and 2. Here it is asserted that the entire membership of the church is likewise apostolic. Apostolicity of membership follows as an inescapable consequence of apostolicity of government. A moral body, despite the fact that it constantly undergoes change and renovation in its personnel, remains numerically the same moral body so long as it retains the same social structure and the same authority. This should be clear from the fact that corporations like General Motors or RCA Victor or nations like the United States, France, or Switzerland remain the same corporate or political entities and are represented before the national or international tribunals as the same moral body, even though there is vast fluctuation in their personnel. Please note the word numerically the same society. A mere specific likeness would never satisfy the requirement of apostolicity. Just for the sake of argument, even though it cannot actually happen, let us conjure up some church which would bear a merely specific likeness to Christ's church, a church which would be like it in all respects except numerical identity. Imagine now that the church planted by the apostles has perished utterly. Imagine, whether you make it year 600, 1500, or 3000, that all its members have deserted. Imagine, furthermore, that out of this totally crumpled society, a fresh and vigorous society springs up and then, after a time, is remodeled perfectly to meet the blueprints of the ancient but now perished apostolic structure. Such a process would never yield a church that was genuinely apostolic, that is, numerically one and the same society which actually existed under the apostles' personal rule. There would be a brand new society, studiously copied from a model long since extinct. The new church might be a decent imitation. It might be a caricature. One thing it definitely would not be is apostolic. So this is indicating an institutional existence. So, and let's get back to one other thing. Because you could say, well, all right, Duke's legitimacy is obviously unassailable, and given all of the, that he certainly approved his successors because he chose them and chose to consecrate them, and so on. The same for the Lefebvre and the others who provided the succession. But the thing was, you still had all these others who were also approved by Pius XII, and continuously so by John the 23rd and Paul the 60th, his resignation, but who, of course, have gone on to create the Noah sort of religion. Well, there's two problems with that. First of all, when they signed Lumen Gentium, they defined themselves as now primarily being members of a society that was in no way bound to the laws of the church, because it is no longer the church. You see, the church was just something that subsisted within there, but it wasn't them. You see what I'm saying? So they signed that. That basically relieved them, by virtue of their new office, of any obligations of the old offices they held in the church. Second of all, of course, as they persisted in that, as they understood what that meant, and evidenced that persistence by their descent into heresy, and by doing all the changes and so forth, which of course existed just so that everyone would know that what they were running was not the Roman Catholic Church. That, by the way, is the whole point and purpose of the changes, so that people wouldn't mistake them for the Catholic Church. So when all that took place, obviously there is a clear break. They broke with the apostles. They broke with the Pope. They broke. Oh, they had a caricature pseudo somebody, they call him Pope of their own, who went along with them in their merry ride to insanity. But you know, but they had broken with the Pope. You say they broke with the Pope procedurally, and then they broke with him formally. So there can be no succession there. No apostolic. There might be valid orders, maybe in some alternate rite, but how are you going to have apostolicity over there, even in some uncorrupted rite, because of the affiliation with the other things? I don't know. Maybe somebody might be tolerated. I can't speak to that. But they can't be a part of what's going on, what was going on over there. They cannot have been a part of it. Or at least not once they understood what was going on. A person might mistakenly for season go along with them because they don't know. And that's another thing. Just signing the documents. I mean, a person could put a contract in front of me to sign, and I think all I'm doing is buying a house or a car, but there's something buried way in the fine print that has this implication that's heretical. But because I don't notice that, does that make me a heretic because I signed the document? Of course not. If that particular problem is brought to my attention afterwards, and I say, hey, I've been tricked, I did not agree to this, if I'd known this document had this thing with this implication, I wouldn't have signed it, or at least I would have lined out this one thing, I'm still not a heretic, and I never was a heretic. It would only be if finding something like that, well, I signed it, and even if I was fooled into it, I stick by it, and now that's, that would be being a heretic. So the documents of Vatican II had these subtle heretical things in them, but the bare fact of signing them doesn't mean a person's a heretic. They become a heretic when, as these little things get drawn out, they accept them and maybe make them part of what they want to do. Then they show themselves heretics. But if upon learning these things and discovering these things, they reject that, they reject this, they reject that, no, we're not going to throw the Mass away. No, we're not going to replace these sacraments. No, we're not going to deny these doctrinal teachings, and so on. You see, in that they have already repudiated the documents of Vatican II, or at the very least, everything in them that is heretical. And then in that case, they cannot be regarded as heretics just because they signed the documents. So I think that pretty much covers what I needed to say there. Next, we'll be talking back to the Marks, now as Marks of the Church. Thank you.